Australian cities are seeing an infrastructure boom, with lots of new rolling stock on order too. Ironically, none of this is from Australian rolling stock manufacturers, who have all but left the field. As late as 2010, nearly all rolling stock operating in Australia was locally designed and manufactured, but this is now the exception rather than the rule. Last century, the Australian rail industry became largely self-sufficient. Locomotives, carriages and wagons are large, heavy items, and the cost of shipping them from the Northern Hemisphere was high. Shipping costs and tariffs have come down, but does that explain why Australian industry has gone missing in the face of the current boom? Based on my observations over 30-odd years in rolling stock design and manufacture, this is what I think happened. The catalogue of rolling stock designed and built in Australia is vast and varied. The mainland state capital cities all have fleets of electric multiple units, and until around 2010, these were nearly all designed and built in Australia. The only exception is Melbourne, where overseas designed and built trains were introduced by franchise operators at the end of 2002. Outside the capital cities, passenger train services are somewhat patchy. Nevertheless, the diesel multiple units currently operating regional services and the locomotive haul trains on the longer distance routes are still all locally designed and built. In 2010, except for iron ore in the Pilbara, almost all freight trains were hauled by diesel-electric locomotives designed and built by Downer or UGL. These Australian companies had licence agreements with US giants EMD and GE respectively. While the engines and traction equipment were imported, the integration of these traction systems into locomotives designed to suit smaller outlines and lower axle loads was done locally. In addition, until 2007, when new locomotives were delivered by Siemens, the electric locomotives hauling coal to the ports of Gladys and Mackay, Queensland were designed and built in Australia. Until about 2005, most freight wagons were also locally designed and manufactured. The wagon building business saw many entrants and many disappeared when demand slackened. Nevertheless, two major suppliers remained, and nearly all freight wagons were locally manufactured until around 2000, when imports began to take an increasing market share. So who were the players? In 1985, Comeng was the largest manufacturer of rolling stock in Australia and was partway through delivering a 570-car electric multiple unit order for the Melbourne network. Yet it was soon to lose its place and then disappear. Comeng had supplied all of Sydney's double-deck trains after displacing Tullock, whose pioneering double-deck trailers were delivered in the 1960s. With room for only one player in town, Tullock closed. In 1978, Newcastle-based Goninan won its first double-deck order, taking a substantial portion of Comeng's market. In 1986, Goninan was awarded the Tangara project for 450 cars. This was a blow from which Comeng never recovered, and although continuing to build interurban trains for New South Wales and completing a number of other projects including trams, electric locomotives and even the ski tube, by 1988 Comeng was in the process of shutting down and closed the gate after delivering the last interurban train in 1989. In the Queensland town of Maryborough, Walkers started building electrical multiple units for the newly electrified Brisbane network in 1979. Further orders for Brisbane followed, and later for Perth, when its suburban lines were electrified in 1991. Walkers remained the sole supplier to Perth until the last of the B sets was delivered in 2019. Clyde Engineering was the dominant locomotive builder for decades, and the 1980s were good years, with 335 diesel-electric locomotives flowing in a steady stream from plants in 4 states, with deliveries to New Zealand, New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, Western Australia and Australian National. However, a slowdown by the end of the decade resulted in several plant closures. In summary, there were too many players for the size of the Australian market. Each supplier enjoyed what amounted to a near monopoly in one corner of the market, but to grow, or even just maintain continuity of production, they needed to break into their competitors' territory. The occasional success of a new player was a major blow for the incumbent in any sector. Once Walkers became the established supplier in Queensland, the loss of the passenger car business in New South Wales to Goninan made Comeng's position precarious. This coincided with a hiatus in new orders across the country, and Comeng's new owners, ANI, decided to vacate the field, selling its relatively new factory in Dandenong to the European multinational ABB, which eventually became Bombardier. Similarly, the entry of Goninan in partnership with GE broke Clyde's near monopoly in diesel locomotives, resulting in a first near-death experience with no new designs or new builds from 1989 to 1991. Clyde was able to survive long enough to pick up an order for 50 diesel rail cars for Adelaide and 15 electric locomotives for Queensland, both of which were effectively repeat orders for products made by the now departed Comeng. Winning the Power by the Hour contract for New South Wales Freight Corp in 1992 to supply and maintain 89 locomotives, that's 5882 class and 3190 class, saw Clyde back on top of its core business. But the loss to Goninan of an order for 50 locomotives for Queensland, the 2800 class in 1995, followed by an even bigger order for 120 locomotives, the NR class, for the newly formed National Rail in 1996, saw Clyde back in survival mode, with another large reduction in its workforce. The mid-1990s saw Goninan become Australia's leading rolling stock manufacturer, but the title was challenged when Evans Deakin Industries, who already owned Walkers, bought Clyde in 1996. Walkers had been largely confined to building electric multiple units for the similar narrow gauge systems in Queensland and Perth. The amalgamated company was in a better position to challenge Goninan across the whole of Australia. This appeared to have paid off when Clyde won the contract to build the Millennium 4th generation double-deck electric trains for New South Wales in 1998, and also a contract to supply the first locomotives with AC traction to Queensland Rail. The much weakened Goninan then became a takeover target and was bought by the United Group in 1999. With the new name EDI Rail announced in 2000, the combined Clyde Walkers Group now had the title, but the Millennium train contract turned out to be extremely difficult. Clyde had originally bid as a partner with the French multinational Alstom. Although 200 cars were initially in prospect, the New South Wales government split these into 3 tranches, with 80 cars initially, potentially followed by a second and third tranche of 60 cars each. Alstom pulled out of the tender when it became clear that subsequent orders were conditional. At the last minute, Clyde was persuaded to bid as the prime contractor to provide an alternative to Goninan. The difficulties with the Millennium contract became apparent just after EDI merged with Downer in March 2001. The New South Wales government did not proceed with the third tranche and instead went to tender for outer suburban cars, the Oscars. This contract was awarded to UGL in 2003. Although the initial order was for a loss-making 10 4-car sets, subsequent orders over the next 8 years took the total to 55 sets. This clearly illustrates the problem of maintaining continuity of work which faced both the major players at the time. After completing the Tangara and NR locomotive projects, Goninan-UGL was in survival mode with very little work until the OSC order. After 2003, the pendulum swung the other way. The workforce at Downer's facility in Cardiff dwindled from around 500 to about 80, and the design office staff numbers were more than halved. Mining activity across Australia began to accelerate around 2005, with lots of work for both Downer and UGL. Initially, the order for locomotives was small and were mainly direct imports from the USA to the Pilbara, but the orders continued to grow, and in Downer's case, especially in Queensland, with repeat orders for the 4000 class. At the same time, QR National broke into New South Wales coal haulage, ordering 12 5000 class AC locomotives from UGL. In late 2005, Downer also won a contract to design and build a new model diesel-electric locomotive with AC traction for SCT, an intermodal transport company. This was a very significant order because it was the first by an independent operator which is not a government-owned entity, nor formally government-owned, and with ambitions to operate in all states. At 15 locomotives, the order was relatively small, but had the promise of sales to other customers after the hard work of initial development. UGL won the next order for mainline locomotives, with 15 for Pacific National, which entered service in 2008. As new coal and iron ore mines opened around Australia, both Downer and UGL maintained almost continuous production of locomotives for nearly 7 years. UGL eventually produced 155 of their C44 ACI, while Downer produced 79 of the GD46C ACE. In Queensland, Downer enjoyed a virtual monopoly and produced a total of 194 of the narrow gauge GD42 CU ACE, introduced in 2000, but in continuous production after 2005. Downer built 245 locomotives between 2003 and 2011, but boom ended in bust, with the last of these locomotives not finding buyers until 2015. With both SCT and PN beginning to purchase Chinese locomotives, Downer ceased locomotive production and ended a 60-odd year relationship with EMD, which had in the meantime been bought by Progress Rail. Progress Rail moved manufacturing back to the USA, but initially retained a local design team which developed a Gen 2 version of the GT46C ACE. This team was finally disbanded in early 2020, leaving UGL as the sole locomotive designer and builder in Australia. Since the end of the boom, UGL has received a few single-digit orders for various customers. UGL also continues to design bogies for non-standard applications, previously for its partner GE's international customers, and more recently for Toshiba, with 140 bogies for Taiwan. The resources boom also saw many wagon orders, and in 2005, Bradken's Ipswich facility celebrated building its 2,000th iron ore wagon for the Pilbara. But to remain competitive, both UGL and Bradken, who had been the major suppliers of wagons, moved their production offshore as the boom began to gather pace. Customers were increasingly sourcing from China directly after CFCLA set a precedent by importing container wagons in 2000. By 2008, Bradken still held about 40% of market share, but as they were unable to compete on cost with China, they opened a plant in Suzhou. By 2017, Bradken had exited the wagon market and is now owned by Hitachi Industrial Machinery. Similarly, UGL formed a joint venture with Texmeco and moved wagon production to India in 2011. The demise of our wagon manufacturing appears to have caused more concern in the USA than locally, as evidenced by articles in the financial press. The graphic for wagon production is taken from a report commissioned by the US industry from Oxford Economics. While the turnaround did not happen overnight, by around 2010, it was clear we had passed the tipping point. Since 2010, there has only been a trickle of small repeat orders for rail cars built in Australia, with all the big orders either being wholly constructed overseas or in some cases with some local assembly when mandated. In 2000, there had been no investment in rolling stock in Victoria for more than a decade, and the Australian manufacturers were expecting the drought to break. However, the Victorian government franchised its rail operations. After involving local industry in the tender process, the new operators, National Express and Connex, instead awarded large EMU contracts to Siemens and Alstom, respectively. These were designed and initially built overseas, although after the first 10 sets, Alstom began to import only the shells, which were then fitted out in Ballarat. The awarding of the Waratah double-deck trains to Downer at the end of 2006 was a watershed for the Australian industry. It was the largest ever order in Australia, with 626 cars, and the New South Wales government only required 20% local content. The rate of delivery would have required more than doubling Downer's existing capacity. Although locally designed, the cars were mostly completed in China. The cabs and electrical equipment were fitted at Downer's Carter facility before testing and commissioning, and although this was not planned, a huge amount of rework was required. The project encountered numerous difficulties, with losses approaching $500 million, absorbing all the windfall profits made by Downer's other divisions during the resources boom. The cars entered service in 2011 to 2014, but Downer's institutional investors had a clear message for the board regarding the risk profile of future contracts. The initial Waratah order was followed by another 24 sets, delivered in 2018-2019, but these were fully completed in China, with CRRC rather than Downer taking the role of prime contractor. Downer's interest is in the long-term maintenance, which provides predictable, steady income. CRRC is currently supplying another 17 sets from China. The first 2 of these arrived in Newcastle in July 2020. UGL took a similar path for the New South Wales New Interurban Fleet, awarded in 2016. This is another large order for 554 cars. Although based on the Oscar design, the new trains are being built in Korea, with Rotem as the prime contractor and fully responsible for the design. The first set arrived at the end of 2019 and is currently being commissioned. In Sydney, the New South Wales Government is committed to a new metro train network, with driverless trains largely separated from the existing rail network. The first section was opened in 2019, running from the northwestern suburbs and joining the existing Epping to Chatswood line. The new sections are not designed to comply with Australian rolling stock outlines, excluding the existing double-deck trains, and brownfield tracks where double-deck trains run now are being converted to exclude them. The electric multiple units running on this line were designed overseas by Alstom, with construction in India. In 2019, the New South Wales Government chose an overseas entrant when awarding a contract consisting of 117 cars for new regional trains to replace the ageing XPT long-distance trains and the Explorer and Endeavour DMUs. Due to enter service in 2023, these will be designed and built in Europe by the Spanish company CAF. Before 2018, all of Brisbane's previous electrical multiple units were built in the Walker's Downer facility in Maryborough, but the new generation trains, consisting of 450 cars, were built in India. Nevertheless, a significant portion of the design work was performed by Bombardier in Australia. In Melbourne, the high-capacity metro train project for 65 7-car trains was awarded to a consortium with CRRC in 2016. These are designed and partially built in China, but the Victorian government mandated 50% local content. The cars are fitted out at Newport and local industry supplying air conditioner units and bogie frames. Similarly in Perth, where all previous EMU stock had been supplied from Maryborough in Queensland, the PTA awarded a contract for 41 6-car sets to Alstom in 2019. These will be an international design, with body shells constructed in India. There is a local content requirement, with the cars being fitted out in a new facility in Perth, which after the construction phase will become the maintenance facility. While state government attempts to include local content are laudable, they are not of great benefit in sustaining local industry. Besides flaunting federal trade law, it negates the local advantage for an Australian car builder trying to maintain continuity of work in a specialised factory in another state. The experience of previous years shows that the Australian market can barely sustain 2 local manufacturers. With all of the recent contracts being awarded to international players, both Downer and UGL have ceased to manufacture locally. Of the internationals, Bombardier can at least claim to be keeping some design work in Australia. Downer also provides some design support for CRRC. Whether this is sufficient to maintain rolling stock design expertise in Australia in the long run is questionable. Similarly, the ad hoc facilities being used for fit-out to meet state government local content requirements are not intended to be used for manufacturing after the existing contracts are completed. As well as the car builders, a number of local component suppliers have seen greatly reduced demand for their products. Comsteel has operated for over a century in Newcastle and still makes forged wheels and axles. Now that most new rolling stock is imported, the market for wheels and axles has been greatly reduced. However, the company does benefit when local content is mandated, as it usually favours local manufacture of bogies. Otherwise, the remaining local demand is for replacing wheels, which, fortunately for Comsteel, wear out several times during the life of a vehicle. Axles, however, are rarely replaced. Comsteel's neighbour Bradcan fared worse, as described before. Bradford Kendall supplied castings such as couplers and bogie frames to the rail industry for 100 years. This work has ceased. Sigma Air Conditioning's history starts in the early 1960s when its founder, Jack Dane, started making air conditioner equipment for Commonwealth Railways to replace imported equipment which was not coping with the harsh conditions of the Nullarbor. Although never enjoying a monopoly, Sigma probably provided more than half of the air conditioning units in all rail vehicles in Australia. To remain competitive, Sigma also moved manufacturing overseas after completing the contract for the Siemens trains for Melbourne in 2003. In later years, ownership changed several times, with Knorr-Bremse purchasing the company in 2010. On the positive side, the local content requirements for Melbourne's high-capacity metro trains have seen a return to local manufacture. Many of the job losses in rail manufacturing were from regional areas. The Hunter Valley north of Sydney was and still is home to Bradcan, Comsteel, UGL and many sub-suppliers. Downer also established a facility here at the time of the Millennium train contract. The respective workforces of these companies are now a shadow of what they were. In 1970, Clyde opened a facility in Bathurst, west of Sydney. It initially made the motors and other electrical equipment for the stainless steel Clyde Hitachi cars, which replaced Melbourne's wooden-bodied Tate trains. The plant went on to produce numerous traction motors, including around 900 for the Tangara fleet. It was expanded to build locomotives, producing 115 until the mid-1990s. It closed in 2014. The UGL plant in Taree, north of Newcastle, operated from 1975 to 2013. This facility made numerous bogie frames and locomotive underframes, but this production was largely relocated to India. In 1973, Comeng opened a facility for bogie fabrication near Mittagong in the Southern Highlands. Following the sale of Comeng, the facility was retained by A&I Bradcan and was leased by Clyde to build the 82 class locomotive contract in 1993 to 95. Bradcan used it for a few years constructing wagons, but it finally closed in 2010. Australian industry has often been labelled as uncompetitive, and it is true that productivity was low in the days of high levels of protection. However, as tariffs were wound back from the time of the Hawke government onwards, Australian industry did lift its game, with an increasing emphasis on efficiency, productivity and quality. In many courses and seminars in the early 1990s, there was a focus on total quality management, just-in-time and other techniques used in Japanese industry. The quality of Australian-made cars improved greatly as Ford and Holden tried to catch up with Toyota. The rolling stock industry also made gains, introducing cellular manufacture and computer-aided management systems. There was a concerted effort to bring costs down in accordance with market demands. However, by the early 2000s, a different message was emerging. In one postgraduate business course I studied, the underlying theme was that there was already sufficient production capacity in China and South Korea, and instead of wasting our energy in metal bashing here, we should instead focus on the smarts, like brand management and design in the fashion sense. Within a decade, this had become a reality. Australian industry has not been without innovation. The Tullock aluminium double-deck trailer cars of the 1960s were world-leading. Comeng then produced fully double-deck trains, and Sydney had a significant double-deck fleet ahead of Europe or Japan. We have seen high-speed tilting trains on narrow gauge in Queensland, as well as the early introduction of AC traction and heavy haul on narrow gauge. We have seen single airbag bogies on double-deck cars and steering bogies on locomotives. But having benefited from the technology developed by local industry, The operators have shown a willingness to turn to overseas suppliers when the price is substantially lower. With too many suppliers and little continuity of work due to an uneven flow of orders, mass layoffs have been all too frequent. Ramping up again for a new contract with little or no revenue until the beginning of deliveries was expensive. Unless the profit margins are high, it is just not worth doing. Yet the struggle for survival meant high-risk contracts were sometimes entered with single-digit margins. Contracts for around $1 billion favour the internationals, who are less constrained by capacity and are in a much better position to balance fluctuating workloads using countries with low wages. Unit prices fall as the size of an order increases. Meanwhile, Australian competition rules prevent local manufacturers from colluding to smooth the workflow, and having a trained workforce in a specialised facility in the wrong state can be a liability. Since the last train left Maryborough for Perth in 2019, there's been no new construction, and Downer is now focused on refurbishment, modification and maintenance work. It is much the same at UGL, which was taken over by the largely European-owned CIMIC Group in 2016, although it continues to build locomotives in small numbers. This leaves Bombardier, which has been producing Velocity DMUs since 2004 in its Dandenong plant, as the only other local manufacturer of locally designed vehicles. The acquisition of Bombardier by the French multinational Alstom has now been approved. While the internationals have taken all the high-value contracts, smaller orders are of little interest to them. There may be no one willing to do these when they arise. The capacity to build rolling stock still exists in Australia, and we still have a pool of people with the skills in design and manufacturing. Unless it is utilised very soon, it will disappear. I hope this is not the end.